course lecture of the course Blockchain in Digital Business. We are very honored today to have Nicky Hickman here, a real field expert on digital identity with decades of experience in how these things work in practice. And she will give an overview of the SSI technology from a human and business perspective. Nicky, are you here?
Wrong button. Hello. Yes, I am here. Let me just wave at you from my kitchen in England and share my screen so that we can talk about this. So thank you so much for inviting me. I've really been intrigued and learned a lot from Gabriella about how self-sovereign identity is not such an obscure backwater in tech, but is really under the scrutiny of students and lecturers like yourselves. So let me go on. Why is that not? There we go. So there are 4 parts to the presentation, and I've really encouraged you to ask questions, and you know, I'll keep the chat open. If you're going to, please feel free to pop things in there. Gabriella, maybe you could look at if people have got hands raised, and I'll pause after each section. So we'll just talk about some of the basics, a little scoot around self-sovereign identity. Then we'll look at, where the money is, what the markets are. And then the last section really goes to the heart of the matter of why all of this matters in the first place. So Gabriella asked me to give you a bit of background on me. So I'm a product and innovation manager. I work in technology, but I'm not I'm not an engineer. Up until a couple of years ago, I had quite a big professional services and IT consulting business, and I sold it a couple of years ago so that I could, just ring the changes, learn some new things, and work more on impact and inclusion related matters. And this is really my background in identity. And that includes quite a lot of work in advertising as well. So a bit more about that later. So I worked for largely in telco and media, large scale consumer facing identity solutions for, multi-channel stuff for, millions of customers with these guys. I've always been very focused on user centricity, user control, our personal privity, and kind of self-reliance. And for a long time, I've been convinced that the best business model around data is effectively a cooperative. So that's a theme that's coming through quite strongly in the market now. I've worked both in R&D and in product shutdown and large-scale operational stuff. I've done government EID programs, as well as commercial market development and strategy. And in 2016, I was asked to help with the sovereign governance framework, or trust framework as it was called at the time. And so I joined Drummond and a very small group of people at that time to start building the sovereign governance framework. And in that group, I very much focused on inclusion, identity for all. I led a task force on guardianship, which is a very important principle. And I'm a contributing member at Trust Over IP, where I've been helping to get the human experience working group going. And I have a strong interest in very many aspects of this fascinating domain. My personal work at the moment is research and impact focused, and I'm doing some research on trusted infrastructures, which is actually funded by the Gates Foundation and the Turing Institute, and that's together with Tradecraft Exchange and the University of Manchester. And I'm also helping UNICEF and the YOMAR team to develop their governance framework. And that's a youth marketplace. So I asked all of you, and thank you for just giving me your thoughts. I was just trying to understand where you guys were coming from. And the answers to this question, you know, what is identity? Obviously, it's such a fraught issue. It has political meaning, social meaning, philosophical meaning, religious meaning. And so sometimes you can get a little bit overwhelmed by all of the loaded meaning and identity, which is important, but for a business person, a product person, a techie person, sometimes it's just useful to separate these things out. I did some anthropology studies a couple of years ago, and they have a concept in there called personhood. And that is the qualities that define a person, and they're actually very different all over the world. So separate out personhood and identity being not the identification of something, but an identifier for something as part of a group. And digital identity is indeed a reflection of that. It is kind of the digital me. But it's I often think of my favorite phrase about it: identity in the digital realm is a function of that context. So there's no such thing as an absolute identity, although lots of people use this term identity with a very specific meaning in their mind. It's essentially my name, what's uniquely me, the one individual person. But actually, we're many people at many times in different contexts. So I guess some of your answers indicated it is a bit confusing, and I still 20 years on get overwhelmed sometimes because there's a lot to take in and think about. And hopefully some of the stuff I'm going to tell you now will help you filter out the noise and the kind of noise to signal ratio now. So there are two distinct uses of identity in the work of information security and the work of marketing and advertising. You use identity either for access control to protect assets and it's a private data state, or you use it for service enrichment. It's the projection of identity. You think about things like a Facebook profile, you're projecting identity, and that is a social data state. So that the subject of this lecture is not data, but when you start thinking about data, data again has no absolutes. It's a function of its state. So protecting data itself is helpful, but it's not the point. The point is protecting against the use of data or misuse of data. So this is obviously Janus in the middle, the god of doorways and beginnings and endings. So practically how it's used in business, in the work of product and digitization is either as part of the security architecture, and I think about that as a kind of right-hand spectrum, the traditional enterprise IAM, identity and access management, or KYC markets and things like that. And typically you're protecting a corporate resource, and you're only letting in the people who have permission to access that resource. So it's all about protection. It's compliance and risk management. All the calculations pretty much are made on that basis. And you're protecting assets of value. Whereas in the social data state, where you're using it for service enrichment, personalization, targeting advertising, personalizing the customer experience, for example, it's all part of the sales and marketing architecture. It's all about data monetization. It's about customer relationship management, and it's about sharing assets of value. You want the customer to share their data with you. You want to be able to share those assets because that's where you get value. Whereas in the vast majority of users of identity, you're protecting something, you're trying to keep folks out. So I'm going to pause there. Any thoughts or questions on the piece so far? Let's have a look at the chats. Okay. So self-sovereign identity is actually really part of a strong human-centric heritage, which is, whereas the right-hand side is very much security, traditional, government, centralized, about big business. For about the last 20 years, there has been this really strong voice, largely emerging in West Coast America, that says there's something wrong, there's something broken on the internet, because we're losing sight of people. And, you know, Kim Cameron, Laws of Identity, if you haven't read them already, I strongly urge you to go and check them out, because those laws still pretty much hold true, even in the world of self-sovereign identity. And my favorite law is law number 6, which is human integration. Then you've got things like the Respect Network, which was all about respect for the individual. The kind of, unfortunately, it's slightly mixed up with a bit of an evangelical, slightly holier than thou narrative, which obscures the great tech that is now emerging. And sovereign really fits into that spectrum, as does trust over IP. But you've also got folks like My Data and people-centered internet. And it's all about rebalancing the power between business, largely, and people. Why are we always protecting assets, using the great tech to protect the assets of businesses and governments? Why are we not using it to empower individuals? And that's largely to do with capital markets and the economic model that drives investment in internet. But again, not the subject of this discussion. And Tim Berners-Lee, who obviously invented the internet, he's also, as many of you have probably noticed in his recent work and his view of the semantic web, has highlighted that, you know, this is from an interview he did with Vanity Fair a couple of years ago. We demonstrated that the web had failed instead of served humanity as it was supposed to have done, and failed in many places. the increasing centralization of the web ended up producing, with no deliberate action of the people who designed the platform, a large-scale emergent phenomenon which is anti-human. So that's a pretty damning indictment, and it's, you know, there's a sadness if you read a lot of this kind of work, not just from him but from others who were really founding fathers of the internet, because they were young and full of hope, and you know, this was supposed to have changed our world, and it has changed our world, but it's just been co-opted and in kind of the wrong way. And that's why self-sovereign identity, instantiating the human in the internet, making the who have agency and empowerment, although the tech alone obviously can't do that, is kind of important, because if we're out of balance at the moment, imagine what could be done if we got that balance back. So SSI also has this identity problem, and this is a blog post from a great guy called Riley Hughes, who's a young entrepreneur based out in Utah. And his business, he wrote this blog post a couple of months ago. There are a number of different terms for this SSI. And obviously, as usual, a bit of politics around it and so forth. The essence of it is that it's this rebalancing, and it is the human at the heart of it. It's also part of a broader change and trends on the web and the internet. So you think about Web 1.0 was very much broadcast and one way. It was brochureware. It was not really interactive. It was driven by information sharing rather than commerce. Web 2.0 and the cloud changed the architecture somewhat. We're still pretty much in a hybrid from a cloud perspective, but you've got commerce driving it and transactions. And Web 3.0 is this decentralization. It's the use of the blockchain. It's layers and ledgers as opposed to stacks and silos. And SSI is just part of that story. Ultimately, identity is just another enabler, a bit like payments, a bit like connectivity. And this is a view from a very recent thesis written by this guy, Jamie Burke, from a VC group called Outlier Ventures. And it's pretty challenging, but it comes from the world of gaming. It includes this very much this blurring of the lines between physical and logical, or physical and digital. It's this kind of almost managed anarchy, and that's again an attempt to reset the balance by overbalancing perhaps on the other side. But obviously at the moment you can see NFTs, for example, are very strong. We're seeing blockchain uses, yes, in business for supply chain and the many, many other things we can use it for, including self-sovereign identity. But that's starting to come together a bit more with the world of crypto, and this value exchange, I think, needs to be thought of together with identity. But my personal belief is there should be separate rails. There's lots of ways you can use tokenization to support an identity architecture, to use it for accounting, to make things quicker, to make things more private. But ultimately, I think you need to separate out the data and the payment rails. And that's kind of reflected in this. Now, I'm just learning about a lot of this. I've been trying to learn about it for the last 3 years. You guys probably know a bit more than I do. But that paper's well worth a read. It's some really interesting ideas. And I love a logical model, personally speaking. And I think Jamie's done a great job with this. So I take a functional view, and these are just some points that I use to think about it when I'm asked by the many people that I've worked with who are not in the SSI community, you know, what the hell is this? Typically they say, oh, the person's in control, aren't they? And in a way that's true, but you can put a person in control using centralized and federated technologies. In a way, that use of that term, the person's in control, doesn't help us. It doesn't help us because your immediate thought, even as someone who's knowledgeable about this, is, well, companies can't control my data and protect it, so how the hell am I going to do it? But if you think about SSI, it's about the edges, not the nodes. It's about our relationships, the peer-to-peer relationships. The person is the point of integration rather than the identity provider or the service provider. There is cryptographic verifiability that underpins it. And it's most importantly of all, perhaps, a thin enabling layer. I'm a bit concerned over the last 6 months or so, number one, that we seem to be just overlaying the existing centralized model with SSI technology. So it's still all about the issuers and the verifiers and not enough about the holders. It's also become a kind of, either it's SSI or it's centralized and federated. And I just don't think that's the case. I mean, practically, it's not a technology choice that any IT or manager or CTO would make. It's going to be, it's just another set of tools that are in your kit bag when you sit down to design something or to describe a product roadmap. There are some features and qualities of this that make it, that solve some big intractable problems in enterprise IAM, for example. But it's not a binary choice. It's not an either or. It's not a you're in the good SSI camp or the bad centralized camp. And finally, there are these principles of SSI which have been, the community's taken time to put together, and they are good, solid design principles for any architecture, but you don't need a blockchain to do it. Certainly that's my, perhaps a personal view. You certainly don't need verifiable credentials. What you do need is to put the person at the center. And that has to flow through your architecture design, your business operating model, and obviously your governance. See a few questions. Have you come across a lot of adversity in the context of SSI? Not really, not adversity, but that sometimes, yeah, there are some. There's a guy called Philip Sheldrake who believes SSI is a sure route to dystopia. His work is worth reading because he's a complex dynamic systems expert and a deep thinker. As I say, I think if you get caught up in this kind of philosophical, ethical debate, which and end up preaching to people, that's not helpful. So I always try and practically go back to the problem you're trying to solve, the customer you're trying to serve, and that normally sorts out the conversation. Next question, what are your thoughts on, can change to That is a very interesting question Alexi is asking. I think, you know, I've been working in IT, telecoms for a pretty long time. So since before digital mobile. So I launched some of the first ever prepay on analog mobile. And, you know, the internet was a distant thought at the time. But at the time we said, you'll be able to get the internet on this. And lots of people didn't believe us. And 3G came and yeah, we'll get there because it's the network effects that will occur, the level of adoption you're getting in big business, serious big business around use of things like tokens, the many uses of things like AR and VR that are coming in like really serious applications in healthcare, in automotive and so forth. Do you feel be the loudest, sir? So I think in terms of decentralizing technology, and I don't think there will be too many objections. I think as usual, it's all in the governance framework actually, and the business side, the business processes. And I think when it comes to crypto, there will be big political and economic folks trying to prevent that happening, because, you know, if you were to draw your Porter's five forces, you'd just see the barriers to entry. But when you look at people like the Chinese crypto and the way finance is starting to flow from that perspective, it's going to become part of cyber warfare, I guess. And that's when it'll be fought out at a kind of geopolitical level, because there are, as I say, some of these fundamental things that are kind of broken in capital markets in terms of the way technology and business are financed. So it'd be interesting how it plays out, but I don't think it's an either or. As I said before, I think it'll start to infiltrate and the network economics will take over, and hopefully network effects, and we'll be good to go. I think, Artu, you're right, Google and Facebook are likely to, well, they've got to find a decent business model that goes beyond advertising. And Google's probably further forward with that than Facebook. But sooner or later, the wealth and the amount of data will just become a liability rather than an asset, I think. Okay. So let's talk business. This is a tool that I've developed over the years, and I use it in all sorts of different ways, largely from understanding a data set, understanding monetization strategies, understanding positioning for clients in the market, understanding the market overall, which we'll see a bit more of. And if you think about identity as a collection of data attributes or assets that is just brought together for a particular purpose in a particular context, then every attribute can be plotted somewhere on this graph. And that's between static and dynamic. Ooh. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, jolly good. Static and dynamic, and inferred and verified. So if you think about just one attribute, which is your location, a static verified location is where you were born. It doesn't really change. It might change, you know, a country suddenly changes its borders. Some aspect of it might change, but the kind of where the GPS coordinates of where you were born doesn't really, so it's a static and it's normally a very highly verified attribute. Whereas where you're going to be next week on Monday morning at 9:30, guessing now, that's A, it's very dynamic, and B, it can only really be inferred. And then obviously in the middle, you've got the self-asserted, which is in a way the essence of SSI. I assert that I was born at this place at this time. And it's the here and now. So it's just a tool, but I found it really useful and it's been helpful to many of my clients. And you can position different markets on this in terms of where they are now and where they want to go to. So here are some different players in the data world. You've got the Googles and the Facebooks who are dynamic inferred data. You know, you just looked at shirts. I infer that you want to buy a shirt. And, you know, then you've got the outdoor context owners, for example. You know, if you own a shopping mall, it's static and it's inferred. You know, it's a place in like a place in the physical world, and the fact that you're in that building infers certain qualities and attributes about you that is then reflected in how media, you know, outdoor media, for example, is put over. A lot of classic marketing tools like Mosaic, which is a socio-demographic marketing tool, is purely based on postcode. So the fact that you live in a particular postcode just infers a bunch of data about you. Whereas when you get into financial services and the telcos, you're talking about a much broader swathe, largely of pretty verified data that is extremely valuable. Obviously, the kind of hardest identity, the most fixed and perhaps what most people think of in terms of identity is your kind of civil ID, your government or legal ID. And all of these players are kind of trying to move into new areas of value. The more verified, generally, the more verified the data, the more valuable. It's not always the case. For example, in some advertising with new products where you're trying to reach new aspects of new groups of needs or emergent needs, then it's valuable purely on the basis of the analytics that you've done and unverified. But generally, the more verified, the better, the more dynamic, the better. Then thinking about identity markets, there is a link here to a big spreadsheet that you can all make use of on Google Docs. So I think about these different markets, and we'll come back to the positioning, but what I did pre-COVID, I have to say, and then maybe changes, is look at a bunch of different documents and reports and predictions on these various data markets. So AML, KYC, for example, people spend hours talking about it, and it's like a golden nugget of value in identity, you know, where someone actually pays for identity. But actually it's a tiny proportion. It's this little orange line here. Whereas secure papers, your passports, your ID cards, is consistently, at the moment, it's the largest part of the market. And obviously there are lots of digital and technical techniques associated with secure papers. The importance of paper credentials has really been highlighted by COVID, and you know, we get back to this blurring of the lines between the physical and digital worlds. So secure papers is in there. When you get into sort of advertising markets and marketing, there's much more about retail footfall analytics, predictive analytics. And then you've got your classic markets around enterprise IAM, ID&V, and consumer IAM. So what's interesting here is the change between the market today, where the number one biggest subset is secure papers, and the market tomorrow, where the biggest subset is predictive analytics. And you can see this growth in consumer IAM, which is fortunate for self-sovereign identity, because by definition, consumer IAM goes across multiple service providers. It requires transitive trust, and it's much easier to design a user experience that is consumer centric. There are some big players in that space. I mean, consumer IAM includes your social logins. It includes players like the ID as a service players, and companies like Jan Rain, which are now called, they were bought by another company a while ago. So when you go to a website and you've got choices about logging in with Twitter or Facebook or whatever, they're the ones that enable you to do that, and then pour all the data that you release when you do that into the back end CRM and customer profile management systems. So pretty big market. In fact, 218 billion by 2025, according to these stats. And I group those various markets into these quadrants. And this is kind of interesting because I would say up until about 4 years ago, the most valuable segment was verified and dynamic. And that's because of the importance of kind of verified attributes in dynamic risk-based authentication, context-based authentication, the increasing emphasis on identity assurance, where you've got things like, you know, the NIST scheme and EIDAS and so forth. Whereas now, perhaps as part of the decentralized world, perhaps because of things like blockchain, but mostly because of kind of hyper personalization, especially in high value domains such as healthcare, it's much more to do with dynamic inferred. So if you think about these broader trends in terms of semantic internet, You think about decentralization, greater value exchange, much greater use of digitization for very high value transactions, such as healthcare transactions or driving a car, you know, or autonomous vehicles, smart cities, smart buildings, the whole world of IoT, then you can see why this ability, you know, analytics will win rather than big data will win. And it's this kind of semantic speed and predictive ability. And in some cases, you know, there's an evolution on from predictive analytics towards what they call prescriptive analytics. And some of that feeds in turn to things like smart contracts. So it's just such a fascinating market. I'll pause there. Any thoughts or questions? Okay. So why does this stuff matter? Why do we care? This guy is he's a professor of ethics at Oxford University, which is just down the road from me here. And last year I was doing a piece of work for a group of lawyers, and they were talking about human dignity, and I thought, well, goodness me, we don't want to start getting into this. But I went off and did a little bit of digging around and research, and I came across this podcast, which is well worth a listen. And he said lots of interesting things in that, but this quote really spoke to me. He says, so we don't allow people to sell their organs, even if they are their own organs. And we don't allow people to prostitute themselves, even if they are in charge of their body. Likewise, there are some information that constitute an individual. So he's not separating identity and digital identity. He's saying your data is part of you. And if we think about the first two slides in the presentation where I was to separate those two things out, but no, we have to think about them holistically. He says they should be protected as we protect their identity. Now that's in that respect, privacy, personal identity, and human dignity are connected. Human dignity is the preamble that supports the whole Declaration of Human Rights. So it's worth going and reading the UN Declaration on Human Rights. We'll come back to that. So this goes to the heart for me. My big passion and driver is digital inclusion. I think digital inclusion is not only important for in and of itself, but it's important because through digital, we can include people in society more generally. And I believe it's nothing to do with disability or race or religion. It's about all of us, because all of us are excluded for different reasons at different times in our lives. And furthermore, if we continue down the road we're on, we are going to create a very exacerbate these divides in society. So here are some quotes which are deliberately taken, not from human rights organizations, but from organizations that are concerned with economic prosperity and wealth. And all of them highlight the importance of inclusion as being important for our collective resilience and prosperity. So it's not about being nice to disabled people or poor people or brown people. It's about us as communities and as societies being more resilient and prosperous as a whole. And I think there are these three core components in these kind of pillars to digital inclusion, and identity is one of them. So the first pillar is obviously connection. You know, how do you connect? Access to networks and devices and electricity and digital literacy and the means to pay for it. So just having a phone is not enough. I've done quite a lot of work in Africa and Asia. I can tell you many people have mobile devices that are not connected, not charged up, and where they can't afford credit. It's because it's a social marker, and in anthropological terms, it's a marker of role and status as much as it is a communication device. But all of those things, so what we normally think about in terms of digital inclusion is just that how piece over here. But for you to be able to actually transact online, assert your existence and your rights, therefore, you need to have the identity, the who and the what, because obviously identity can equally apply to a thing or an organization or a group. And then the final piece, and this is emerging, it's at the moment, in the vast majority of cases, with the exception of blockchain, obviously, that payment rails kind of sit on top of the connection, but it's something you can do with you, and sometimes you have to pay money, and sometimes people just make money off you and your data. But I think this means a value exchange, and I think there are probably different types of value. There's money, obviously, but there's also intellectual capital, environmental capital, human capital, social capital. All of these are units of value, and making the leap to the balance sheet will come. There's a great book, which is about 20 years old now. It's called Intellectual Capital, the New Wealth of Organizations. And it was written at a time when the most valuable companies in the world had been those with biggest real world assets, capital assets, like, you know, mining companies and oil companies, companies with lots of plant and machinery and, you know, things that went on the balance sheet as depreciable assets. And then this book was written at about the time that the most valuable company in the world was suddenly Microsoft and IBM, with these intellectual assets, IP, soft assets. And they found a way, this book posits a way that you can put that on their balance sheet. And of course, now, any of you who've ever looked at a set of company accounts will know there are tangible and intangible assets on the bank account, on the balance sheet and the P&L. In the future, I think we're going to have other types of value on that balance sheet, carbon capital, and assets related to that, social capital and assets related to that, human capital, and the relationships that we have. So fundamentally, for a proper digital inclusion, that value exchange needs to be there. The basic function is the ability to make and receive payments and the ability to store and borrow economic assets. So one of my roles at the moment is I am the chair of the Identity for All Council at Sovereign. And this program that we're putting in place to deliver against the mission of the foundation, which is Identity for All, is my current obsession. So this work-life play with money in the center is another model for identity that I use all the time. So if you think about how you use your email addresses and your kind of social media, you have three core persona in your life. One of them is your work and study. One of them is your civil identity, your kind of utilitarian identity that's necessary for paying taxes and electricity bills and so forth. And one of them is your play identity, your kind of consumer identity. And if we think about those, the only one where you really need to verify your identity is life. At work, you're pseudonymous, and at play, you should be anonymous. Of course, you're not, but you should be. So we've got 3 core programs that we're supporting, each targeted at using identity, a digital identity, to deliver impact against UN SDGs. Because identity is just an enabler, we've said that, and identity can make a difference. But in the world of identity for all, we use inclusive design, human-centered design. So we start at the edges. We start with people like this project, which is with hidden home workers in India, working in the garment manufacturing industry. This is refugees in Myanmar and on the Myanmar-Thai border. And this is young people in Africa. So we've got partners who are NGOs. They're doing the programs on the ground, sovereigns backing them up. And what we're trying to do is build a full 4-layer instance of the trust over IP stack. We've obviously got the sovereign network. We've got some great governance frameworks at layers 4 and 1. But that's not an identity, a functional identity that anyone can access at the moment. We need all the other bits and bobs. So we're learning as we go. We're applying for a bunch of grants, and I'm always happy to see anyone who's keen to join the Identity for All community group. And this matters, and I said it before, and it was this guy, Jeff Aristey, and his organization that led me on my journey of understanding the relationship between identity and our human rights and justice, social justice, and justice in the other sense as well. Because if you exist, if you're instantiated, you can assert your rights, and you can also hold others to account. And that's the essence of justice. So no pressure, guys. You've just got to make it work. Okay, that's it. Any thoughts or questions? Okay. Look, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always, you know, I do some mentoring at a school for advertising, actually, which is also a social enterprise, I might add. I'm always keen to learn from students. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I think I would like to add here that here is a very good possibility for all of you to ask any questions related to SSI, because Nicky Hickman is a real field expert on this, and she is the one who is able to answer all these questions that you have in mind now. Yes, Erno, please. Could you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. What are your thoughts about the Midas system that is being collected in, I think, in Africa?
The Midas system.
Yeah, it's like ADAS, but for let me check. Let me check. Mandated identity authentication system.
I haven't come across it. I'll check it out, but anything that starts with the word mandated.
Yeah, I think
gets my backup. Yeah.
It's let me. It might have been the wrong one.
I think there's lots of really interesting stuff happening in the developing world.
Yeah, it's. I think it's funded by EU and United States.
Okay, well, I will look into it. And
it's to collect identification from people living in Africa. So if those people might migrate to Europe, they would already have their IDs stored.
Yeah, so we've had some discussions with people like International Federation of the Red Cross and other NGOs concerned with migration and identity. It is a huge challenge. That's, we're going to have mass migration due to environmental factors and geopolitical stuff, and economic migration is going to be ongoing. What we've found is that identity for migrants is often something they don't want to bring with them. The whole point, if they've got an identity, they can be sent back. So I understand why the Western governments are wanting to give people these identities, but the system that's being designed, for example, for the refugees in Myanmar and Thailand, enables them to dispose of it and then obviously recover later on, because it can really, it can put their lives in danger. But, I think sometimes when, as Westerners, we focus a bit too heavily on things like privacy, and for people who are in living in poverty or in desperate situations, it's much more about utility and access. And as you've seen with things like Aadhaar, there is a bit of a stick and carrot, but overwhelmingly people want Aadhaar, which is the national ID system in India, because it gives them access to welfare and it enables them to assert their rights to what they're due from the government. So it depends on how Midas is framed.
Yeah, the Midas system, I just checked, it's migration information and data analysis system. Yeah, and it's done by International Organization for Migration. I was just wondering that with SSI, the person themselves is in control of their identity, but in this case, some people might not be, because it's put into this more larger database. How would they be able to then have control over their identity again? By living in a EU country, or because the system is not there from their own country?
No. I mean, in theory, any identity system can issue a verifiable credential you look at what Microsoft are doing, for example, that you can then use within a wallet and have control over it. And you know, any data item is about a relationship. As we said, you know, it's about the edges, not the nodes. So there's always going to be someone else with some aspect of your data. Personally, as I say, I think because it's about the relationship you have with that entity. So in a way, it's as much their data as it is yours. But it's how the data is used that matters. I often use, I've got a slide on that I often use, which is Darwin's evolution of man, with data on the left-hand side, and then it goes through usable data, information, knowledge, and then on the right-hand side, you've got actionable insight. So that in and of it, that the control of your identity is perhaps better placed in terms of how that identity is used and not the data in and of itself. There's a question here from Linda on must-reads on digital inclusion. I don't have any suggestions on that, I'm afraid. There's some, the quotes all come from reports from those organisations that are about inclusion. Here we go. So that Inclusion Matters is a pretty chunky report. This WEF report, they actually, WEF, I think, did a report last year or the year before, which was all about a big thing about the strategic identity. And that had a lot on inclusion. And again, this OECD paper on well-being in a digital age is also useful. Pleasure, Linda. Enjoy. Just think about your granny. I always think about when I'm old and crusty, I want to be able to use this. There's a question here from Ansi. Any thoughts about the right to be forgotten? Is this the right to be forgotten in the context of an immutable blockchain? Yeah, that does raise some issues. I think, yeah, we've all got the right to be forgotten, but we've got to remember a curtailed right, even under GDPR. You know, if it's a financial transaction, for example, then there are other rules and regulations that trump it. Nearly always the government have a fail-safe. We can do anything we want to. As I said before, any data set is actually a relationship between you and that particular service provider or other entity. And so I guess I've designed enough systems to remove identity and personal data from enterprises, and it's very, 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 very hard to do if you're going to do it properly. Even with SSI, obviously you can revoke credentials, you can revoke DIDs, and I think they're doing some new work in India at the moment on revocation. There's the ability, although unused, to do tombstoning on the ledger. So it can be done, but it's really, I always come back to purpose, you know, and good data health in your organization. and just don't hang on to anything and treat it like toxic waste, you know. Don't hang on to anything unless you absolutely have to. Is there an emerging SSI project that you didn't mention in your presentation, but are interested in following its development? Well, there are lots of great SSI projects and work that's going on at the moment. One area that I didn't mention that I'm particularly fascinated in is metrics, the ability to quantifiably measure trust, decentralization, resilience, and all of the qualities that are in the principles of SSI and the governance frameworks. We've done some work on it. But the reason I'm keen on common metrics is because I've always managed identity capabilities using basically five KPIs. It drives your roadmap, it drives your business case. Having the common metrics will help us get towards an interoperable network of networks. Having common metrics will help us build an understanding of what we really mean by trust, because if identity is a fraught word, trust is even more fraught and obscure. And I just know that the tech can give us some quantifiable answers. So that's an area of interest for me. Very interesting question from Timu here in terms of PLC. Why would a company that's got a bunch of data assets go for decentralization? What are the incentives for them? The basic one is it is better business. You will unlock, not just by using SSI alone. There's a bunch of other stuff that needs to go on. As always, the tech alone never solves anything. But if you think about that rebalance and just the sheer scale of what's involved in a big company managing data, making use of that data, number one, it costs a lot. Number two, it's a massive risk. Number three, you build up a shed load of technical debt. And although there's always a tendency for big data to beget big data and centralization, I think we're well past the days where a regular phrase that you heard in the boardroom was, we own the customer, in inverted commas. 10 years ago, everyone wanted to own the customer and have a single voice of the customer, a single customer view, and that doesn't really exist anymore. So you just got to look at what your business does, what the business models are. There are lots of emerging new interesting business models, even for some of the big like data, audience aggregators and data platforms. Again, there's a bunch of stuff I could send on that around data cycles and P2P business opportunities in data markets, but depends on what that business is. Okay, I think we're nearly out of time.
Can I ask one question? I would like to ask, because I always hear from SSI experts that one of the problems is that actually the people, they are not prepared to be in charge of their own data. They don't care where their data resides. where it is stored, and they don't want to take the responsibility for that. So from a citizen's perspective, from the end user's perspective, do you think that what kind of training do the people need, or what kind of information sharing do the people need in order to be able to be responsible for our data and make conscious decisions on how this data is used and where to whom to sell it if possible, or to with whom to share it, and so on?
Excellent question. I actually think we shouldn't, I know lots of people in the community think we should be educating individuals and consumers and so forth, that we should really emphasize this I control my own identity piece. But as you point out, that scares a lot of people. You know, I can't manage my weekly food budget. How can I manage, you know, my data? And as it's an enabler, right? So we don't ask, people do control how their phone works, their networks can, you know, they make the choice to dial a number or not, or switch it on or off or whatever. But we don't explain what they're doing with that. We don't say, oh, well, you know, you're connecting a circuit and you're using it over copper twist, and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. So in the same way, identity should just be boring. You shouldn't really notice. It should be within the customer experience, as always, whether it's SSI or anything else. This idea that it's easy to get to do the stuff I want to do, and it's easy to protect my assets, be they data or economic assets. And I think the focus on human experience or user experience, customer journeys, just needs to be exactly the same. Because if you think about it, in the same way, you know, like real world identity, the ability to show a passport or a driving license or whatever, SSI is often, you know, in fact, real world identity or lifelike identity is another term, where it's you making your choice as to who to share that data with. That can be achieved with a centralized system. It just depends on what you do with it. And yeah, explaining that the data is securely stored using cryptographic key, you know, an exchange using it might be helpful for some people, but for the vast majority of people, I think it's still logging in. It's still, you know, filling in a form. It's still these very mundane things. So I think the same things are true now that were true 20 years ago. Better, more user-friendly T's and C's that are not longer than the American Constitution, as in the case of Facebook. Plain language, inclusively designed, minimal, you know, minimal sharing, minimal disclosure. Go to look at the laws of identity. And if you can design a system with the laws of identity, I don't think the question about control really matters. And I think it's pretty arrogant to say to people, oh, you know, users don't want to control their data, you know. More, it's a bit like clothes. One of my friends always talks about clothing, and in a way, clothing is analogous with digital identity, because it enables you to project certain things about yourself and keep other stuff private. And some people walk around in a pair of shorts and a tank top, and you know, others are covered head to foot in a, you know, in a burqa. So there's choices.
Thank you. I would have another question if other people don't have, because I know that Nicky has been part of the team who were designing actually the SSI principles, and you were talking now about metrics. So how do you think these SSI principles can be achieved by an SSI ecosystem or SSI solution? I mean, this is always not a yes or no question, but we are speaking about the level of fulfilling these principles and how realistic this is, and what this depends on whether an SSI ecosystem fulfills these.
I think they're kind of design principles which are sometimes competing. You know, security sometimes competes with, you know, equity and inclusion, and privacy sometimes competes with data protection, strangely enough. So I think, or representation perhaps, I always believe, and is kind of borne out with my experience, that as long as you've got the customer in the room, use inclusive design approaches such as persona, or human-centered design approaches such as persona, and you keep it very closely in mind, the purpose of the transactions. I think it's certainly, you will always end up with something that is subscribes to the principles of SSI. But remember, I said that there is this kind of background of being slightly philosophical and a bit too evangelical and kind of holier than thou about it, preaching rather than, there's a bit of that tendency in the community, and unfortunately I feel a little bit the principles of SSI are on that, because, you know, enterprise architects and solution architects and engineers and product managers sit down and you look at, wow, look, there's 12 things that I've got to do. Oh my God. What about my customer? But if you just put the customer in the room, design for them, design for their outcomes, you truly cannot go wrong.
Thank you. And can I still have one question? I would like to ask, what do you think the dark side of SSI is? Are there any unknown consequences, some bad consequences that a possible mass adoption of SSI would follow?
It will almost certainly be gamed and perverted. Almost certainly. It happens with any powerful tech, you know, but it will be down to human choices, but it will be, because that anonymity and that immutability will ultimately, yeah, you know, people will be, there will be harms, digital harms from it, because it's a powerful thing, and like any powerful thing, like a knife, you know, it can be used to kill or to cure. And as with any tech, how it's used, the purpose, once again. And I do think that particularly the link with the whole world of crypto, and kind of there's always another model that I use quite often to think about identity as a triangle with value at the top, or utility, and then privacy and security at the bottom. And the reason I think they're all competing tensions. So sometimes, you know, the privacy security debate is, you know, like CCTV cameras. You know, we're going to have them for your security. And if you're doing nothing wrong, you should have no problem with them. But obviously they impinge on privacy. And then, you know, the more you tell me about them yourself, the more you cede your privacy, the more value I can give you in terms of personalized offers or access to more services. So there are always these tensions in any transaction where identity is used, which is most transactions. And I think that because it's hard to break the cryptography, it will be broken. Ultimately, security is just a big, long game. There's always going to be someone smarter, and, you know, but because of the high privacy in cryptography at the moment, it is a lot to do with the dark web. That might lead to countervailing stuff from the state and regulators in terms of the security side of it. And I think people could get lost in the middle. I mean, I don't think SSI is going to save humanity, and you might think that's surprising coming from someone like me, but it's just another bit of tech. Honestly, you can go way back in digital identity and look at all sorts of things, all sorts of attempts to redress this balance. It's true that never before have we had a bit of tech that could really enforce that. But, you know, I'm pretty certain that in the next 5 to 10 years, the role of blockchain will be massively reduced in SSI. And I think part of the reason for that will be because of the abuses that come about. Because we might, you know, we know that in sovereign, for example, the blockchain is used correctly, and there's no personally identifiable information, even though under GDPR, your DID is PII. So we kind of get ourselves twisted around these definitions in the regulatory, but you know, without a shadow of a doubt, that there are other places and other people who are putting stuff on a blockchain that is immutable and that is personal data. And I did a job in Vodafone R&D, working with folks like IBM and some of the big retailers about 10 years ago. And we were taking CDRs, call data records of telco mobile networks, and seeing what insights we could derive from the call data records. And these records just say the geolocation where the device was used, whether it was data, a text, or a call. And in the case of the call, a B number. And it's all used just for billing purposes. That's what a CDR is supposed to be used for. And we did this experiment where we looked at call data records for inbound roamers to a particular geography. So these are new to the network, you know nothing about them, they're visitors to the country, and they come onto the network. And within 48 hours, we had 72% correct attribution of their socio-demographic profile. We could tell age, we could tell gender, we could tell whether they A, B, C, D, you know, C1s, C2s on that kind of marketing spectrum, all within 48 hours, just by looking at the patterns. So even the tiniest amount of data, you can derive insights if you really want to, which is why I always say it's down to the business processes, the governance model, the contract that is the substance of that relationship. More recently, I worked with a PhD student in Scotland at Edinburgh Napier's Block Pass Lab, and there's a paper actually coming out soon, and we looked at IndyScan, which is obviously the public dids. We were trying to understand if there were any kind of risk metrics that we could derive, any insights we could derive about the entities undertaking the transactions that you made use of those dids. And obviously IndyScan is public, and we were able to derive huge amounts of insight just from the small amount of data we could see on Sovereign Mainnet about actually who had done those transactions. So with the best will in the world, it, once again, I say that, you know, the data can't really be protected. And I think everyone's kind of feeling now like we're secure. We've got nothing to worry about because it's cryptographically secured, isn't it? But the reality is you can derive pretty much any data. You only need to know a few data items about an entity before it's pretty easy to guess who they are. So unfortunately. You're portraying the desired image. Yeah, close. Yeah, do we want to be nudists? Maybe naturalists, I think they call them. Germans are very keen on that. Cool.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that it was super interesting and a lot of insights, and we are very happy to get some real experts' view on SSI and not just reading reading about it, and have a really interesting conversation and get some insights about the negative sides. I think it was very interesting to hear that it's just a technology, and actually what matters most is our attitude towards it, and the ethical guidelines, and also the business should be formulated such or designed such that it takes into account also the human viewpoint.
Absolutely. Apologies to any engineers in the room, but it's how you use it that matters. And you can achieve SSI solutions without going anywhere near a blockchain. And you really can. It's been a pleasure. And I'm always happy to answer questions. I would never say I'm an expert. I don't think any of us are really experts, but you always learn something by a conversation or a question, don't you?
Thank you very much. We know about Nicky that she's a real evangelist and she has time for everything.
Okay. Jolly good. Well, good luck with your course, and thank you once again for asking me to join you. I enjoyed putting that together.
Thank you. We will continue offline, and I would like to say to the students that we will continue at 1:15 in the other Zoom room, and let's have a lunch until then. And thank you very much for participating and also for the questions. Thank you very much, Nicky.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.